She waited by the sea until he returned. Evelyn had always been drawn to the sea. It wasn't just the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks or the way. The salty wind tangled her hair. It was the feeling that the ocean carried secrets, stories whispered from places she'd never seen. She grew up in a small coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever really changed. Days slipped by slowly there, measured by the tide and the cries of gulls. Evelyn often sat on the cliffs with her sketchbook, capturing the restless waves, the curve of the lighthouse on the horizon, the subtle shades of blue and gray that only someone who stared long enough could truly see. But the day she met Lucas, the ocean looked different. The water was calmer somehow, as if it already knew their lives were about to intertwine. Lucas was a traveler, or at least that's what he called himself. He arrived in town with nothing but a worn backpack, a notebook filled with scribbles, and an old camera that looked like it had seen more of the world than she ever had. He wasn't like the locals. His voice carried the rhythm of distant places. His eyes seemed to hold 100 unspoken adventures. He didn't belong here, and yet, for some reason, he stopped. They met on the pier. Evelyn was sketching the lighthouse when he approached, his voice breaking the sound of the wind. "Hey," he said, holding up his phone with an almost embarrassed smile. "Do you know how to get to that lighthouse? I think I got lost. Twice." Evelyn could have just pointed, but for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself standing up, tucking her sketchbook under her arm, and saying, "I'll show you." That single choice changed everything. The lighthouse stood at the edge of town, weathered but still proud, a silent witness to decades of storms and sunsets. Evelyn had walked the path to it 1,000 times, but that day it felt different. Lucas asked questions along the way. About the town, about the cliffs, about the strange little shop that sold seashell wind chimes. And Evelyn, usually quiet, found herself answering, laughing even. When they reached the lighthouse, Lucas didn't take a single picture at first. He just stood there, looking at the horizon, his eyes distant. "Do you ever feel like the sea is waiting for something?" he asked. Evelyn tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "I don't know, like it's holding its breath." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just smiled faintly, and together they stood in silence, listening to the waves. Lucas was supposed to leave after 2 days. He stayed for 3 weeks. Days melted into evenings, evenings into nights, spent talking on the beach until the stars faded into dawn. Evelyn showed him the hidden coves where she used to collect shells as a child, and Lucas told her stories of places she couldn't imagine. Cities where lights drowned out the stars, deserts that stretched farther than the eye could see, mountains that felt like the edge of the earth. Evelyn sketched him under the golden light of dusk, his hair ruffled by the wind, his eyes crinkled when he laughed. Lucas took pictures of her when she wasn't looking, sitting cross-legged on the pier, tracing lines in her sketchbook, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them called it love, not yet, but it was there. In the way her heart skipped when he brushed sand from her shoulder, in the way his voice softened when he said her name. But beneath every laugh, every lingering glance, was the quiet knowledge that this wasn't forever. Lucas never planned to stay, and Evelyn always knew it. The day finally came when his bus ticket was folded in his pocket, and his backpack was packed again. They met at the lighthouse that morning. The sky was pale, the kind of morning that felt suspended, like the day didn't want to start. Lucas stood there with his hands shoved into his pockets, looking younger than he had in all the time she'd known him. "I don't want to go," he admitted softly. "Then don't," she replied, though her voice wavered because she knew he couldn't stay. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "Will you write?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Every day," he said, and maybe he meant it in that moment. They hugged, too long, too tight, and for a heartbeat neither of them wanted to let go. But eventually he stepped back. He looked at her one last time, eyes searching hers as if to memorize them, and then he turned and walked down the road. Evelyn stood there until his figure disappeared into the distance, the sound of the waves filling the silence he left behind. Seasons passed. The first few weeks, there were letters. Long ones, short ones, sometimes just a single postcard with a picture of a place Evelyn had never been. He wrote about bustling cities and lonely roads, about strangers he met, and sunsets that reminded him of home, though he never said where that home was. She wrote back, of course. Every letter smelled faintly of the sea, every envelope smudged with graphite from her sketches. But months went by and the letters came less often. Then they stopped. Evelyn didn't stop living. She moved to the city for art school, just like she'd always dreamed, though it terrified her to leave. She found herself surrounded by noise, colors, and people who didn't know her name. She learned to love the chaos, but some nights, when the streets were quiet and the city lights couldn't quite cover the stars, she thought of Lucas. She wondered where he was, if he was still searching for whatever he'd been looking for. Sometimes she sketched his face from memory. Years later, Evelyn returned to her hometown. She had built a life, one filled with art shows, new friends, and quiet victories. But when she stepped off the train and smelled the ocean again, it felt like nothing had changed, and everything had. The lighthouse was still there, stubborn against time. The cliffs were still waiting. One evening she walked down to the pier as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in colors too soft for words. And there he was, Lucas. Older, yes, his hair a little shorter, his face marked by time, but unmistakably him. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the years between them seemed to fold away, collapsing into nothing. "I told you I'd write," he said with a half-smile, voice a little rougher now. "And you didn't," she replied, though there was no anger, only relief. He stepped closer. "I tried," he whispered, "but words weren't enough. I had to come back." The sea roared behind them as if welcoming them home. And under the same sky where it all began, they finally found what they had both been looking for.